Today we are looking into idealism. What prompted this is that I noticed that I am probably a hardline subjectivist, in the case that that's why I need to read up on idealism, because my bias must be skewed in some way. But I come from the simple argument that everything I see, it is me doing the seeing, and therefore I would say that we all have to concede subjectivism. Not extreme hardline subjectivism, right? That I am creating the entirety of reality. Right? I remember Kant's noumenon and phenomenon, and I would say that, yeah, like the outside reality exists, and sorry, shit in my glasses. The outside reality exists, and but the only access I have to it, it's through my own subjectivity. That's my metaphysical understanding of reality. So I am curious what the idealists say and what this will mean. Specifically, what I've been recommended was German idealism, and we'll get to that, I suppose. Right. And we're reading it from Stanford's Wikipedia of the thing, I guess. Right. This entry discusses philosophical idealism as a movement chiefly in the 18th and 19th centuries. Although anticipated by certain aspects of 17th century philosophy and continuing into 20th century, alright, it revises the standard distinction between epistemological idealism, the view that the contents of human knowledge are ineluctably determined by the structure of human thought, and ontological idealism, the view that epistemological idealism delivers truth because reality itself is a form of thought and human thought participates in it, in favor of a distinction, earlier suggestions by A.C. Ewing, between, oh, how are you fucking kidding me? How long is this sentence? Did I miss a period or something? Yeah, this is one sentence. I was just in the assumption that this place was gonna make life easy. Right? This place got recommended to me. I gotta say that the first impression is not great. Right. It revises the standard distinction between epistemological idealism, the view that the contents of human knowledge are ineluctably determined by the structure of human thought. Alright, human knowledge ineluctably. What that means? Necessarily? Not to be avoided or escaped. Inevitable. Why not say necessary? Where are we? Here we go. That's frustrating as well. Can we get something a little... Determined by the structure of human thought. Alright, so that's epistemological idealism. That's very interesting, though. Why is that called... Because I thought idealism was saying that reality is real. This sounds like subjectivism, right? That the structure of human thought determines what we know, right? That's subjective. Our human thought is subjective. revises the standard distinction. All right. And ontological idealism, the view that epistemological idealism delivers truth because reality itself is a form of thought and human thought participates in it. In favor of this, a distinction earlier suggested by Ewing between epistemological and metaphysical arguments for idealism as itself a metaphysical position. Yeah, I don't know how I feel about this, how the writing style. We'll try some more. After discussing precursors, the entry focuses on the 18th century versions of idealism due to Berkeley, Hume, Kant, and the 19th century movements of German idealism and subsequently British and American idealism. And that concludes with an examination of the attack upon idealism by Moore and Russell and the late defense of idealism by Brant Blanchard. With the possibility exception of the introduction, see section 1. Each of the sections below can be read independently and readers are welcome to focus on the sections of most interest. Exactly. So, introduction. I just got confused by the other introduction, so let's get this introduction out of the way. Maybe this one. The terms idealism and idealists are by no means used only within philosophy. They are used in many everyday contexts as well. They are indeed, yeah. Optimists who believe that in the long run, good will prevail are often called idealists. Yeah. This is not because such people are thought to be devoted to a philosophical doctrine, but because of their outlook of life generally. Indeed, they may even be pitied or perhaps envied for displaying a naive worldview and not being philosophically critical at all. Right. How is this relevant? Right, just defining the word we're using. It's a good idea, but this personal note, right? How people are looking at them, that kind of seems like that's not really relevant. Even within philosophy, the terms idealism and idealist are used in different ways, which often makes their meaning dependent on context. However, independently of context, one can distinguish between a descriptive or classificatory use of these terms and a polemical one. What does that mean? Another word, I don't know what it means. Of or pertaining to polemics or controversy. Right. So they can distinguish between classification and polemical. Why use polemical here? Why not just say controversial? It probably means something different. Polemical probably means something different, and just because I don't know a word doesn't mean that people shouldn't use it. Yeah. If it's more apt, then definitely there is reason to think that that should be used instead, indeed. Although sometimes these different uses occur together. Okay. Their descriptive use is best documented by paying attention to the large number of different idealisms that appear in philosophical textbooks and encyclopedias, ranging from metaphysical idealism through epistemological or aesthetic to moral or ethical idealism. Within these idealisms, one can find further distinctions, such as those between subjective, objective, and absolute idealism. Alright, and even more obscure characterizations such as speculative idealism and transcendental idealism. It is also remarkable that the term idealism, at least within philosophy, is often used in such a way that it gets its meaning through what is taken to be its opposite. right? As the meaningful use of the term outside depends on a contrast with something considered to be inside. So the meaning of the term idealism is often fixed by what it is taken to be its opposite. Thus, an idealist is someone who is not a realist, not a materialist, not a dogmatist, not an empiricist, and so on. Right, I thought an idealist was a realist. Well, it's all these words can be used in different contexts. Given the facts that many also want to distinguish between realism, materialism, dogmatism, and empiricism, it is obvious that thinking that the meaning of idealism, as determined by what is meant to be opposed to, but what it is meant to be opposed to, leads to further complexity and gives rise to the impression that underlying such as characterization lies some polemical intent. And polemical was right. They're trying to be what's that? When you're against something just because to be against something? Obstinate. No, that's not it. Right. Within modern philosophy, there are sometimes taken to be two fundamental concepts of idealism. Right. Something mental, the mind, spirit, reason, will, is the ultimate foundation of all reality, or even exhaustive of reality. Oh, this is idealism. That's interesting. I was completely confused. Although the existence of something independent of the mind is conceded, everything that we can know about this mind-independent reality is held to be so permeated by the creative, formative, or constructive activities of the mind, or some kind of or other, that all claims to knowledge must be considered in some sense to be a form of self-knowledge. You know what? I was completely misunderstanding this, right? In my memory, I'm terrible with names. I thought idealism was realism. I thought this was called subjectivism. Right? That all knowledge is created from, the self-knowledge. So then I probably am somewhat of an idealist then. Idealism in sense 1 has been called metaphysical or ontological idealism, when idealism in sense 2 has been called formal or epistemological idealism. Yeah, so I'm at definition 2 makes sense to me. Well, in the second sense, because this here, I mean, from one point I would concede that from my perspective, that is the foundation of all my experiences are founded within my mind. All my observations are generated by my mind. But that depends on what you mean. Yeah, I wouldn't call that the ultimate foundation. I could take both. And if we're talking about ontological stuff, things that exists, then I would say the primacy of the non-mind. Yeah, I think the mind was arisen from something, but from my perspective, there is only mind. But my assumption, and that is what it is, right? My assumption is that there is something out there in the world, and that was primary. Because if, in my mind, if I was primary, if my mind, spirit, reason, will was primary, actually they're saying something mental. Alright, they're probably gonna say God then, idealists. That God is the ultimate foundation, and that I reject that, but And I reject the idea that I created all of these things. No, they do exist independent of me. Like people exist independent of me. I reject the idea of the philosophical zombie or the automaton. I live with the assumption that other people exist and they have their own wills and reasonings and minds. I can see that it's an assumption on my part, but it is an assumption that I feel necessary to make. It doesn't have to be that way, though. It's just, why would I create all the suffering? If I was the ultimate foundation of reality, why would I create all these things? I wouldn't. Yeah, I wouldn't. And if I did, was it really me then? Like, was it really... If it's not part of my mentality, right? Let's say I'm a god, but I split out from myself, then it's not... The thing that I am, my mind, is no longer part of that previous god that created me. And so then it again becomes that reality itself is created from outside of my experience. That makes sense. Logotree says, I'm going to send you a Trump flag through Amazon. Hello, Logotree. Nice to meet you. I mean, I don't know how you could do that, but if you can, I would suggest you would spend your money doing something else, because I'm not gonna hang a Trump flag. Actually, I don't even have any paintings up yet. I'm newly moved in here, and I need to set up. And the walls are concrete, so it's difficult to hang stuff. So it's gonna be a while, and even when I start hanging stuff up, it's gonna be art. It's not gonna be political stuff. I mean, I do enjoy talking politics, but I would not want any politics to be hung on my walls. Ah. I don't think so, anyway. How are you doing today, Logo Tray? Tree? Logo Tray. Probably. Alright, the modern paradigm of idealism, in sense one, might be considered George Berkeley's immaterialism, according to here we go, yeah, the immaterialism, according to which all that exists are ideas and the minds, less than divine or divine, that have them. Yeah, that doesn't work for me. Well, I suppose my mistake in that was thinking that it was a mind. They only said something mental. There could be that we together, all our minds together, is in like a mush, and we generate reality together. But then again, reality does exist outside of us from our perspective, because I'm just part of it. But that could be the foundation, I suppose. But then again, the function of how reality is created by the collection of minds is outside each individual mind. Right. Like a forest, a tree is not a forest. A mind is not reality. Maybe. Logotray says, what about a marijuana plant flag? Oh, I haven't been smoking that in a long while. I had to stop. I was an addict. I couldn't deal. Logotray says, I'm doing fine. How about yourself? Oh, I'm pretty good, yeah. I'm enjoying this. I was started with a complete misconception. I'm terrible at at what idealism is. So I'm learning about idealism. I've heard like 2 people recently had told me to read Hegel, and that is German idealism. We'll get to it. Tilgen says, is this a MAGA stream? What is MAGA? Nice to see you again, Tilgen. I think I recognize your name. I don't know what MAGA is. Logotray says, we don't smoke meth, we only smoke weed for 20. Only, nothing else. I don't smoke anything, yeah. I mean, I hardly drink alcohol. I stopped doing tobacco and I hardly drink alcohol anymore. I did used to smoke a lot of weed though. But I couldn't deal. It had negative consequences on the rest of my life and I got, yeah. Addictive behaviors. Wasn't good for me. But I think that it's fine that you do, yeah. I think that was specifically me. I think that I have a very addictive personality, that I get very easily addicted to stuff. At the moment, I'm addicted to Final Fantasy XIV, for example. But that doesn't have too many negative impacts on my life, except for just not unpacking. I think that's fine. Right, the fountainhead for idealism in sense 2, which is the one that I like. That something exists independent of the mind. Yeah, I definitely want to concede that. Right, but all knowledge is subjective. Yeah, all knowledge is subjective. Might be the position that Immanuel Kant asserted. Ah, of course, yeah. That is actually on point, because my metaphysical understanding of reality is very influenced by Kant's noumenon and phenomenon. For those who doesn't know, it's like the phenomenon is the experience of the thing itself. That's the life that I live. But then there's the noumenon, that is the thing in itself. And the thinking is then that physics and science and whatnot, they're trying to figure out what the thing in itself is. Take atoms, for example. I have no experience of an atom or being an atom, but yet I am built up on something that we call atoms. So the point of science is to try to reach and figure out what is the noumenon, right? Taking steps towards getting more and more understanding about the noumenon, but conceding that we do only have the phenomenons to go by. That is our perspective, our eyes. We have to use our eyes to look at things. And he was, if not clearly in the first edition of his Critique of Pure Reason, then in his Prolegionema. I actually had that open on a thing. Someone recommended reading that. But Kant is so frustrating to read. He's a terrible writer, yeah. To any future metaphysics. And in the refutation of idealism in the second edition of the Critique, according to which idealism does not concern the existence of things, but asserts that only our modest representations of them. Exactly, yeah. We look for the representation of the things. But we have a methodology where we believe and assume, right? That's an assumption, that we gain knowledge about the thing in itself. Which, philosophically speaking, of course I have to concede that I do not know. It's an assumption. Above all, space and time are not determinations that belong to things in themselves, but features of our own minds. Kant called this position transcendental and critical idealism. And it has also been called formal idealism. Right. However, Kant's position does not provide a clear model of idealism at all. Does it not? Well, Kant himself claimed that his position combined empirical realism with transcendental idealism, that is, combined realism about external spatio-temporal objects in ordinary life and science with the denial of the reality of space and time at the level of things as they are themselves. It also insisted upon the reality of things as they are in themselves, existing independently from our representations of them, thus denying their reducibility or representations or the minds that have them. Wow, that was another long sentence. That's definitely a very long sentence. I didn't get the last part. I got lost somewhere in this tiny sentence. Fucking dense. Learn to use the period sign. Make your point and then make another point. Right? It also insisted, right? You don't need to, right? You could have separated that out easily. Alright, so it also insisted upon the reality of things as they are in themselves, existing.
Something everybody else in history done wrong.
What, like eat the food, drink the water, and breathe the air?
Exactly, this thing itself exists, denying their reducibility to representations or the minds that have them. But I reject that. I say that one does not exclude the other. Things can exist, and I have representations of that reality. Those representations do exist as well. It's just different frames of reference. Yeah. Like, yeah, we're denying that an apple is a pear. Yes, that is what my understanding of Kant, or well, what I would say anyway, that I would reject the idea that an apple is a pear. Or actually, I would reject that an apple is a telephone. Well, fuck, that's not a... I would reject the idea that a pear is a telephone. Because they are completely different. But they are still aspects of... They are still in the complete set of physical objects. Yeah. So the representations in the mind is an object that exists in reality necessarily. I mean, that's not... That can't be news to anyone. And take Santa Claus, for example. Santa Claus exists. If Santa Claus did not exist, how the fuck could we talk about Santa Claus? I'm not saying that Santa Claus has a beating heart and blood pumping in his body and he's alive like I am. Definitely not. But the idea exists within reality. Everything that we can imagine exists within reality because we exist within reality. Right? I exist within reality. Therefore, every thought I have exists within reality. Therefore, Santa Claus exists within reality. It's just a different type of existence. And there are many different types of existence. Right? We can say that I exist as the mind, MacDread, the thing that I identify as. But that is just an abstraction, right? You cannot, from a physical, biological perspective or quantum mechanics perspective, you cannot find that thing. Not yet anyway, right? It's not one thing, it's a collection of things. They would call it emergence. But from my point of view, right, my mind seems to me to be one thing, and that one thing exists. Right. In this way, Kant's position actually combines the transcendental ideality of space and time with a kind of realism about the existence of things other than mind. Yeah, exactly. It is a combination, right? One does not exclude the other. That's my understanding. So instead of using Kant as any kind of model for epistemological idealism, in this entry we will distinguish between metaphysical and epistemological arguments for idealism, understood as a metaphysical doctrine, namely that everything exists in some way mental. Yeah, so which one was Alright, this is the metaphysical, yeah. While epistemological idealism is Kant's idealism then. We thus agree with A.C. Ewing, who wrote in 1934 that all forms of idealism have in common the view that there can be no physical objects existing apart from some experience, and this might perhaps be taken as the definition of idealism, provided that we regard thinking as part of experience and do not imply by experience passivity, and provided we include under experience not only human experience, but the so-called absolute experience, or the experience of a god, such as Berkeley postulates. Right. They didn't even take the full sentence. That's a mouthful. Do not imply by experience passivity. Okay. But all forms of idealism, whether they are epistemological or metaphysical, then there can be no physical objects existing apart from some experience. Yes, I would concede to that, because physical, that concept is a human concept. So the object is only physical in the sense that we have given it the name physical. That's an attribute, right? Physical is an attribute that we ascribe to an object. That doesn't mean that objects do not exist. Well, object is also something that, an attribute that we ascribe to existence, I suppose. From the point of view of existence, and we're talking, well, it depends, actually. It depends on, it's very binary thinking here. Right, let's say we take all of reality. All of reality is big, right? And in the middle of reality, in the middle of your reality, what do you find? You find yourself. So yourself, you are here, right in the smack middle of reality. Right, and then you can go, let's, well, think in 2D, but I'm thinking in 3D. You can, from where you are, you can look around in different directions. Right? Here, there, wherever. Over this way, you start looking and you see the physical world. You look outside yourself. And we look at physical things. The things that we call, that's where you're looking. You're looking at the physical direction. You see a table, you see a glass of water, you see a telephone. All those things, you look out and they gets reflected into you or whatever. So the physical objects then exists within you, right? There is something out there, but your experience of the thing is a physical object when you touch it, you feel it. But the actual object in itself, the thing in itself out there, you don't have access to. What is it like to be a glass of water? I mean, is there even an experience, right? That you don't have existence to, you don't have access to that thing. Then you can look at another direction. You're here in the center. That was looking at physical things, right? So let's say we'll look inside at the mental things, conscious things, awareness things. Then you can look in and look in and look in, and then you will find the subconscious, that there is stuff that the you are doing and thinking that only happens to you. It happens, right? You're not aware of what's going on. Sometimes you just get angry, sometimes you get happy, sometimes a random thought pops into your mind. Where do these things come from? You don't know. You don't have access to those processes. Just like you don't have access to how it is to be a glass, you don't have access to the generation of thought. You only have access to the thought when it arrives. You don't have access to in the mind or the subconscious mind. Well, it's not in the mind. That's the point. It's outside of the mind. And you don't have access to it. Wait, where did I get to this? There can be no physical objects existing apart from experience. The same with mental experience, right? There can be no mental objects existing apart from some experience, right? All that stuff you don't have access to. This might be... Right, and we're talking about, since we're talking epistemologically and naming them and whatnot. That we can do. And then, but the other... The metaphysical idealism would say that the thing in itself is not even real. It's all dreams. It's all generated. Like the subconscious mind, it doesn't have any physical outer... Right? From you in the middle here, that there exists nothing outside of the you in any direction. Yeah, they would have to concede that. That would have to be the metaphysical idealism. Right? Because it's as soon as you... If you involve another mind or an outside copy of your own mind, or if you indeed created yourself, the experience that you're having, that is outside of you. So that's... It has to be one. It has to be only from you. And that leads to the same question again, right? Why would I create? Since there are stuff that is outside of my experience, I don't see how we can say that I created it. Like I said, the generation of a thought. I'm not in control of that, which means that comes from somewhere else. That is not me. That is not in my mind. I'm not privy to what is happening. And since I am not privy to what's happening, it has to be outside. Hasn't it? Otherwise, you could argue that the subconscious is part of you. That it is you doing it in your subconscious, but I don't have access to it, so it's a question of where we draw the line. And if you draw the line like out there in the universe and saying that, well, that is you, or in here far inside the subconscious, well, that is the mind experience, then you have included, like, the word kind of loses its meaning, doesn't it? The word of a mind or a spirit or whatever, all that stuff, that word, it doesn't mean what it used to mean anymore. It doesn't mean mind, it doesn't mean the self or my experience or anything like that. It's just synonymous with reality. So I would say it's like just a semantic mistake. Yeah. But where were we? Provided that we regard thinking as part of experience and do not imply by experience passivity. I would argue that passivity is not really something we can do while we're alive. Passivity happens way after we're dead. Actually, I'm not even sure about that. Yeah, well, the mind becomes passive when you're dead. Maybe when you're unconscious. We don't know that. Let's assume that a rock is passive. It just gets acted upon and does no acting of its own. That would be passivity, right? Watching TV is one way of looking at passivity, but that I would not draw that line philosophically speaking there. I would say watching TV is an activity. That is something you do. It is not something that where you're lacking to do something. And provided we include under experience not only human experience, but the so-called absolute experience, or the experience of a god, such as Berkeley postulates. I don't know what Berkeley postulated. In other words, while reducing all reality to some kind of perception is one form of idealism, it is not the only form. Exactly. Reality may be reduced to the mental on other conceptions of the latter. Thus, Willem de Vries' more recent definition of idealism as the general theory that reduces reality to some form of other of the mental is just roughly the genus comprises theories that attribute ontological priority to the mental, especially the conceptual or ideational over the non-mental. Wow. We also agree with Jeremy Durham, Grant and Watson when they write that the idealist, rather than being anti-realist, is in fact a realist concerning elements more usually dismissed from reality. Yeah, exactly. It's all part of reality. Recent definition of idealism. Roughly, the genus comprises theories. Alright, genus, that is idealism, comprises of different theories, and there are many of them. Like we were talking about metaphysical and empirical, for example. That attribute ontological priority to the mental, especially the conceptual or ideational over non-mental. Yeah, exactly. Ontological, that's existence, right? Of relating to ontology, of relating to essence of the nature of being. Yeah, being, existing. Yeah. And that is like, we're like Kant, and what I would say is that epistemological, like all knowledge, the existence of all knowledge is in the mind. Yeah. Right. Namely, mind of some kind or other. Wait. Mental is just... write that. Namely, mind of some kind of other. Yeah, the idealist denies the mind-independent reality of matter, but hardly denies the reality of mind, or on their account, which goes back to Plato idea of or forms as well as minds. We will not consider pre-modern forms of idealism in any detail. Nice. We're just looking at modern ideas. I like that. The idealist denies the mind-independent reality of matter. It depends on how you define matter. I would say that what we call matter exists, and it exists in some form or other. And my guess is that we're getting closer and closer to understanding what that matter. Right? We get more and more information about. My thinking is that through science we get more and more knowledge about the thing. Well, how we can look at the thing in itself. And we will call that matter, we will call that atoms, we will call that air, we will call it water, right? We will give them all the names. Again, epistemological focus from my side, yeah. Right. However, following Irving, see chapters 2, 4, 5, and 8, we will distinguish metaphysical from epistemological arguments for realism. Yep. Metaphysical arguments proceed by identifying some general constraints on existence and arguing that only minds of some sort or other satisfy such conditions. Epistemological arguments work by identifying some conditions for knowledge and arguing that only objects that are in some sense or other mental can satisfy conditions for being known. Yeah, I would definitely go the epistemological route. So I'm curious about the other route then. The metaphysical route, because that sounds only weird to me. In particular, epistemological arguments for idealism assume that there is a necessary isomorphism between knowledge and its object that can obtain only if the object of knowledge is itself mental. Yeah, I don't think you obtain knowledge. I think you create knowledge. Right? Knowledge is created, not obtained. Right? There is no, like the old Plato idea of forms. I don't think it's really a thing. Well, someone creates knowledge, and I can obtain the knowledge that they created. And actually, in that, we can talk about it like in everyday language. We can talk about obtaining knowledge, learning, right? I can read what someone else has written, and I can obtain the knowledge they have presented. But from a epistemological and more primary rational sense, that knowledge I create from observing reality. Yeah. I observe, I read the text, and then I generate knowledge. And my knowledge often will often not look the same as the knowledge from the mind that wrote the text. Because there will be misunderstandings and different interpretations and just different framework of knowledge. I have a different framework of knowledge than whoever wrote this text, because we are not the same mind. We have similarities and we have differences, but they don't have my history and I don't have their history. Move those things over. Is that better? Cat wanted some room. We propose that there is the difference between We propose that this is the difference between epistemologically motivated idealism and a more neutral position, which might be identified with philosophers such as Rudolf Carnap, W.V.O. Queen, and Donald Davidson, holding that of course we've always known things from some point of view, but any external question about whether or not our point of view corresponds to independent reality is either meaningless or at least not answerable on theoretical grounds. Yeah, on philosophical grounds, it is. Anything I say about the world out there is inherently from my point of view, so it becomes unanswerable, meaningless. Whatever I say happens within the frame of reference of my mind still. So I say that there is something out there and we don't have access to it. It's just that. It's just there's a lot of stuff out there that we don't have access to. It's not there is no access to it. We can generate more knowledge about the thing out there, but all that knowledge is based on one form of methodology or other, but it's generated from within, looking out. And when looking out, right, the outside world gets let in, so to speak. It is in order to preserve the distinction between traditional idealisms and positions such as the latter that we recommend retaining the claim that reality is in some way or other exclusively mental and thinking of epistemological arguments for idealism rather than epistological idealism as such. Okay. Of course. All right, we're talking about epistemology. Right, when we're talking about epistemological idealism, it would make sense then to say that, yeah, everything that's out there in the real world or whatever, it's part of the real world, but it is outside of the purview of my eyes. It's not accessible to me. Therefore, I can take epistemological idealism and make the argument that it is just in the mind. That actually... Yeah, that is actually a good idea, right? It's just the only thing when we have to point out that is when somebody, when the distinction you can make is when someone says, well, are you saying that nothing is out there? I'm saying, yes, there is. I'm just saying that I don't have access to it. And therefore, it becomes meaningless to talk about it. Well, that's the difference between is it though? No, that's a difference of pragmatism. That's not a metaphysical or epistemological difference. Yeah, I like bringing in pragmatism in everything. And pragmatically, it makes a lot of sense talking about the outside world that we perceive. Because it's helpful. But that's a separate question, isn't it? Of course, these strategies can be combined by single philosophers. By a single philosopher, Berkeley does so, and so does Kant in arguing for the transcendental idealist part of his complex position. Others separate him, for example, F.H. Bradley and McTaggart constructed metaphysical arguments for idealism, while Joshua Royce and Blanchard offered epistemological arguments. Right. The difference... I think a problem I have with the metaphysical way is that it's binary. The thing that I presented is kind of binary as well, but it's the metaphysical one that they've presented, it's like mental over here, physical over here, well, objective over here or whatever. And that becomes pointless. But what I'm saying, right, with the epistemological stuff, I can say that there is stuff over here, 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 like all over the place that we don't have access to. But we can move in all these directions and kind of grow our knowledge and in that sense get closer to whatever's out there, even though it's still the same. We still are locked in the same bubble of subjectivism, or we're still locked within our own minds. It's just we can expand our minds. Yeah, we can create more stuff. In what follows, we will concentrate mainly on the discussion of philosophical theories that either endorse or claim to endorse idealism on ontological and or epistemological grounds. Right, ontological. I need to remember using that word. It's a great word. At some points in its complex history, however, above all in the social as well as philosophical movement that dominated British and American universities in the second half of the 19th century and through the First World War, idealism is either of its philosophical forms was indeed connected to idealism in the popular sense of progressive and optimistic social thought. Wait. Social and all right. They were thinking. Wait, I don't get the consequence. Oh, they're gonna talk about the history of the thing in the context of where these discussions took place. That makes sense, yeah. This was true for figures such as Bradley and Royce and their predecessors and contemporaries such as Green and Bosanquet. There has recently been a considerable interest in British or more generally Anglophone idealism as a movement in philosophy or even a social movement, but we will not pursue that here. Alright, yeah, good. I was wondering why is this relevant? This seems like something else. And that's what they said. They just brought it up to say this is something else. Our distinction between epistemological and ontological idealism on the one hand, and that between metaphysical and epistemological arguments for idealism on the other, and has not always been clearly made. Yeah, but wait, they were talking about metaphysical, ontological, but isn't ontology? Isn't that part of metaphysics? But however, the American philosopher Josiah Royce pointed in the direction of our distinction at the end of the 19th century. On Royce's definition, epistemological idealism involves a theory of the nature of our human knowledge. Yep. And various decidedly different theories are called by this name in view of one common feature, namely the stress that they lay upon the subjectivity of a larger or smaller portion of what pretends to be our knowledge of things. Right. Metaphysical idealism, he says, is a theory as to the nature of the real world. Yeah, exactly. However, we may come to know that nature. Namely, as he's quoting from another philosopher of the time. The belief in a spiritual principle at the basis of the world without the reduction of the physical world to a mere illusion. The belief in a spiritual principle at the basis of the world without the reduction of the physical world to a mere illusion. We may come to know of that nature. There's a cat here. He needed some attention. That's what he said. Right. But Royston argued that epistemological idealism ultimately entails a foundation of metaphysical idealism. Okay, in particular that the question as to how we transcend the subjective in our knowledge. But that's the problem, right? It's the binary thing that has to be a certain way. Of course we transcend.
Sounds were a real horror show. It's very realistic. And you could even get the heavy breathing and panting of the tall-chopping mouth chicks.
Right, my understanding of metaphysical idealism is that well, actually, I don't know about that, but in epistemological, we can, through pragmatism, right? How do we transcend the subjective in our knowledge? Through pragmatism. And when we use pragmatism, it doesn't matter. That's why it's an epistemological idea, right? While the metaphysical idea, right. Of course, since I come from the metaphysical point, the ontological thing, if I indeed created all of the universe, you're all automatons and don't have minds by your own. If that is indeed how reality exists, me accepting the epistemological view makes that pointless, right? They're not really working together. Right, my assumptions that I made with my epistemology, right? Since it's all right. No, that's where I was going, right? From my epistemological idea, we can never know if there is something, right? If the reality in itself is completely mental, or if it is something on the outside of it. Right, from the metaphysical idealism, right, looking at the metaphysical idealism through the lens of epistemological idealism, the thought becomes that metaphysical idealism is an unanswerable question, how it is structured. Right? While epistemological idealism has a different structure, and we talked about that before, right? That I can imply from my experience that there is something outside of myself, since there are stuff that I don't have access to. Just by the nature of not having access to it, it is outside of my realm of knowledge, my realm of experience. And that is, the purely individual, although it exists for both metaphysical realists and idealists, can only be answered by metaphysical idealists. I don't know about that. We will argue similarly that while epistemology can entail idealism under the assumption that isomorphisms between knowledge and the known must be in some sense necessary, and that this can be only so be so only if the known is, as well as knowledge, is in some sense mental. This should be distinguished from the more general and extremely widespread view that our knowledge is always formed within our own point of view, conceptual framework, or web of belief. Exactly. This view may as well be the default position of much of 20th century philosophy, yeah. Continental as well as analytic, but does not itself entail that reality is essentially mental. Yeah, exactly. From that point of view, that it's the question is like, is reality essentially mental? Sure, if it is mental, right, then we're talking about some form of God, right? And since no form of God has made themselves known, that kind of implies non-mentality. I suppose the way to get that answered would be the like an all-encompassing God or gods making themselves known and telling us thusly. Telling me thusly, actually, yeah. In my mind, if that happened to me, that the god or gods would make themselves known and tell me about how reality worked, I would still from my own point of view, I would trial and error this stuff, because from how I understand it now, I would assume that what happened was a mental break, alright? Schizophrenia or something along those lines. That's where my mind would go, like how I look at it. So not only would I need them to tell me, I would also need them to tell everybody else, these supposed gods. Because they would be, right? They would have to be. And my point still stands. I think my point still stands that from my point of view, that is not metaphysically if there was a or multiple gods or whatever that created and are all powerful together, they are outside of the mind. Therefore, the metaphysical idealism falls apart from my perspective. Right. Our distinction between epistemological and metaphysical arguments for idealism can also be associated with a distinction between two major kinds of motives for idealism. Those who are grounded in self-concepts, that is, in convictions about the role that the self or human being plays in the world, and those based on what might correspondingly be called world convictions. That is, conceptions about the way the world is constituted objectively, or at least appear to be constituted by to a human subject. Right. Concerning motives based on self-conceptions of human beings, idealism has seemed hard to avoid by many who have taken freedom in one of its many guises: freedom of choice, freedom of the will, freedom as autonomy. And to be an integral part of any conception of the self worth pursuing. because the belief in the reality of freedom often goes together with a commitment to some version of mental causation, and it is tempting to think that the It is tempting to think that the easiest, or at least the most economical way to account for mental causation consists of mentalizing or idealizing all of reality, thus leading to ontological idealism, or at least to maintain that kind of causal determinism that seems to conflict with freedom is only one of our ways of representing the world, thus leading to an epistemological idealism. Motives for idealism based on world convictions can be found in many different attitudes towards objectivity. If one is to believe in science as the best and only way to get an that is subjective, independent concept of reality, one might still turn to idealism, at least epistemological idealism, because of the conditions supposed to be necessary in order to make sense of the very concept of law of nature, or the normativity of logical inferences for nature itself. My belief is that science is the best so far. To not create an objective conception of reality, but stretching and creating a stronger. Right. It does say subject independent. It doesn't say independent of subjectiveness. Right. My thinking is that I am a subject, you are a subject. If we can get all the scientists to agree that this is how the world works, if we jump down, we fall down. That is subject-independent knowledge. Assuming, of course, the metaphysical view that we are all... Well, it's not even the metaphysical view, just putting the framework, the axiom, so to speak, that every person is a subject. And if every person says, well, if you jump up, then you fall down, that becomes subject independent because all the subjects are saying it. Singular subject independent. But it's still dependent on subjective views, if that makes sense. Yeah, and that makes sense to me. That is why I've turned to epistemological idealism, sure. That could be one of the reasons why I'm so happy with epistemological idealism. If one believes in the non-conventional reality of normative facts, one might also be drawn to idealism in order to account for their non-physical reality. Plato's idealism, which asserts the reality of non-physical ideas to explain the status of norms, and then reduces all other reality to mere simulacra of the former, might be considered a forerunner of ontological idealism, motivated by concerns for the reality of norms. An inclination towards idealism might even arise from considerations pertaining to the ontological status of aesthetic values. Is beauty an objective attribute of objects? Or from the inability or the unwillingness to think of the constitution of social and cultural phenomena like society or religion in terms of physical theory? In short, there are about as many motives and reasons for endorsing idealism as there are different aspects of reality to be known and explained. Yes, I like that. There are many different ways of looking at it. That is definitely a way to look at it that makes sense to me, right? You're in the middle, and all over here we have different aspects of reality to be explored. Or there is stuff to be known about. And you don't have to know reality to know about reality. Yeah, I like that. You don't have to know reality to know reality. You don't... Right, and it goes the other way around as well. You don't have to know why you like licorice or why you don't like licorice to enjoy a piece of licorice. And you can have a... That is, right? You know what licorice tastes like. There we go. You know what licorice tastes like. And on the other hand, you don't have to enjoy licorice or have any sort of knowledge of what it means to be licorice to know stuff about it. Right? The atomic composition of licorice. I don't know. Right. Although we have just referred to Plato, the term idealism became the name for a whole family of positions in philosophy only in the course of the 18th century. Even then, those whom critics called idealists did not identify themselves as such until the time of Kant, and no sooner did the label come into use than did those to whom it was applied or whose use it themselves attempted to escape or refine it. Right, as already mentioned, Berkeley, the paradigmatic idealist in the British tradition, did not use the name for his own position. Did not use the name for the position, which he called rather immaterialism, and Leibniz, at least some versions of whose monadology might be considered idealist, also did not call his position by that name. Rather, in contrasting Epicurus with Plato, Leibniz called the latter an idealist and the former a materialist, because according to him, idealists like Plato hold that everything occurs in the soul as if there were no body. Whereas on the materialism of Epicurus, everything occurs in the body as if there were no soul. Yeah, I like that. That's pointing out the binary thinking here, that it's either or. And I think that's a problem of scoping the question, or scoping your ideas of the words that are being used. Soul and body. What do those terms mean semantically? How have you defined them? Where do you draw the line? And if you draw, right, you can draw the line black and white, so there is no soul, and you can draw the line so there is no body. Both of those things are doable, philosophically speaking, but that kind of... If you do that, then the words lose their meaning, and they are no longer useful in the philosophical discussion. So framing your philosophical discussion in that way seems like it breaks your philosophy and whatnot. Although in this text, Leibniz also says that his own view combines both these positions. It seems to have been Christian Wolff who first used idealism explicitly as a classificatory term, Wolff often considered the most dedicated Leibnizian of his time, although in fact his position was more eclectic than at least some versions of Leibniz's. He set out to integrate the terms idealism and materialism into his taxonomy of philosophical attitudes, of those who strive towards the knowledge and philosophy of things. In the preface to the other edition of his so-called German metaphysics, it was called the German metaphysics, but the German title is Vernünftige Gedanken von Gott, der Welt und der Seele des Menschen, auch allen Dingen überhaupt den Lieberheit. Alright, and it goes on. Wolff distinguishes between two basic attitudes, one of which he sees exemplified by the skeptic, the other by what she calls the dogmaticists. The skeptic doubts the possibility of knowledge in general and thus refuses to defend any positive claim at all. It feels like that's a problem that's been done in philosophy, right? Saying that, well, I doubt the possibility of knowledge. And someone else says, yeah, the dogmatist says that this is true, right? This is strict, and right, that's what that the difference that took us on this path towards Hegel in the first place. The dogmatists, they say that there is a truth and nothing but that truth. And anyone who believes otherwise is either lying or mistaken. Alright, and both of these sides use the same word knowledge, but they don't mean the same thing. Right? They have, if you look into the semantics and the definition of the word knowledge in these two different attitudes, you will find something completely different. Alright. Oh, the skeptic doubts the possibility of knowledge in general and thus refuses to defend any position, any positive claim at all. Right? It becomes... that sounds like a straw man, right? If they claim that there is no possibility of knowledge, that is a claim. By contrast, the dogmatist puts forward positive doctrines, and these can be divided into those which posit as a fundamental either one single kind of entities, Arthur Dingy, or two different kinds. Wolff names the supporters of the first position monists and adherents to the second as dualists. This amounts to the division of all dogmatic doctrines, that is, all knowledge claims with respect to the ultimate constitution of reality, into monastic and dualistic theories. Exactly. Right? It's been very black and white, the history of it. And I don't like that black and white, 0 and 1. Here is where the term idealist then makes its appearance in Wolff's typology. He distinguishes within the monists between idealists and materialists. Idealists concede only spirits, or else those things that do not consist of matter, whereas materials do not accept anything in philosophy other than the corporeal, and take spirits and souls to be corporeal force. Dualists, on the contrary, are happy to accept both bodies and spirits as real and mutually independent things. Yeah, alright, so I would be considered a dualist in this sense, but I would probably call myself a pluralist rather. right? As we were talking about before. Don't have access to what it's like to be a glass. I don't know what it's like to generate a feeling, right? I don't know how it feels for neurons firing. Right? I don't have access to the subconscious. Well, neurons firing is the physical, but you get my point. There is an endless world within that I don't have access to. Dualism, alright. Wolff then goes on to distinguish within idealism between egoism and pluralism. Exactly, pluralism. Depending on whether an idealist thinks just of himself as a real entity. Oh, wow. I was thinking about some other type of pluralism. Yeah, not this at all. I would say that pluralism necessarily leads to not being idealism anymore. I think that is where you end up in pluralism, so I think you kind of have to go the egoist route from what I said earlier, yeah. Depending on whether an idealist thinks of himself as a real entity or whether he allows for more than one spiritual entity. The first of these positions would also come to be called solipsism. So that solipsism would be a variety of ontological idealism, but not all idealism would be solipsism. Right, just to reiterate that thing. If you and me together are creating reality, then, and we're both minds, right? But whatever stems from your mind would be something other for me. Right? You're over here, I'm over here. That's two minds. And we are in like reality is all us. From my, right, there's a border between you and me, right? Plurality. There's a border between us. And I don't have access to whatever it is you create. And you don't have access to whatever I create. So from that, idealism falls apart. So it has to be egoistic, I think. Well, I'm not the best at this because in my mind, metaphysical idealism or ontological idealism falls apart, like however you put it. Right. Wolff's way of classifying a philosophical system was enormously influential in 18th century continental philosophy. For example, it was closely followed by Gottlieb Baumgarten in his 1739 Metaphysica, which was in turn used by Kant as the textbook for his metaphysics and anthropology lectures throughout his career, and whose definition of dogmatic idealism, as contrasted to his own transcendental or critical idealism, would also be that it is the position according to which there are only minds, and so it is no surprise that almost all talk about idealism was heavily influenced by Wolff's categorization. This is so because it reflects the main metaphysical disputes in the 17th and early 18th century philosophy on the continent quite well. In terms of Wolff's distinctions, these disputes can be framed as disputes between A. monists and dualists, and B. idealists and materialists. Nice. Positions in this debate were often influenced by perplexities surrounding the ontological questions of interaction of substances, although they were also influenced by the epistemological debate over innatism. Although neither dualism, whose main representative was Descartes, who asserted the existence of both res cogitans as res extensa, nor monism, allegedly though debated, represented by Spinoza in the materialistic version, right? And by Leibniz in its idealistic form, succeeded in finding satisfying answers to this and related questions. In the early modern era, these disputes shaped the conception of what the objects of metaphysics was supposed to be. Yes, exactly. And these shapes needs to be discussed, and I guess that is where we are at right now, where it's more a lot of semantics, I guess. Sorry about that yawn, but that feels like perfect timing to take a break. Idea. That was a damn long introduction. All right. So thanks for hanging out today. We'll continue this tomorrow. Have a good one. And cheers.